perceptible result, care enough to have kept us stable in condition. In a freak of humor, she named this animal Fashion, after a noted racer of the old times, which had been raised in the county and had beaten the famous Boston in a great race. She always spoke of Fash with a tone of real tenderness in her voice, and looked after her and discussed her ailments, which were always numerous, as if she had been a delicate child. Mounted on this beast, with her bags and bundles, and shawls and umbrella, and a long stick or pole, she used occasionally to make the tour of the neighborhood, and was always really welcomed, because, notwithstanding the trouble she gave, she always stirred things up. As was said once, you could no more have remained dull where she was than you could have dozed with a chinkapin burr down your back. Her retort was that a chinkapin burr might be used to rouse people from a lethargy. She had an old maid's tongue. By the younger members of the family she was always welcomed, because she furnished so much fun. She nearly always fetched some little thing to her host, not her hostess, a fowl, or a pat of butter from her one old cow, or something of the kind, because, she said, Abigail had established the precedent, and she was a woman of good understanding. She understood that feeding and flattery were the way to win men. She would sometimes have a chicken in a basket hung on the off pommel of her old saddle, because at times she fancied she could not eat anything but chicken soup, and she did not wish to give trouble. She used to give trouble enough, for it generally turned out that she had heard someone was sick in the neighborhood, and she wanted the soup carried to her. I remember how mad Joe got because she made him go with her to carry a bucket of soup to old Mrs. Ronquist. Cousin Fanny had the marks of an old maid. She was thin, scrawny, we used to call her, though I remember now she was quite erect until she grew feeble. Her features were fine, her nose was very straight, her hair was brown, and her eyes, which were dark, were weak, so that she had often to wear a green shade. She used to say to herself that they were bad eyes. They had been so ever since the time when she was a young girl, and there had been a very bad attack of scarlet fever at her home, and she had caught it. I think she caught a bad cold with it, sitting up nursing some of the younger children, perhaps, and it had settled in her eyes. She was always very liable to cold. I believe she had a lover then or about that time, but her mother had died not long before, and she had some notion of duty to the children, and so discarded him. Of course, as everyone said, she'd much better have married him. I do not suppose he ever could have addressed her. She never would admit that he did, which did not look much like it. She was once spoken of in my presence as a sore-eyed old maid. I have forgotten who said it, yet I can now recall occasions when her eyes, being better, appeared unusually soft, and, had she not been an old maid, would sometimes have been beautiful, as, for instance, occasionally when she was playing at the piano in the evenings before the candles were lighted. I recollect particularly once when she was singing an old French love song. Another time was when on a certain occasion someone was talking about marriages and the reasons which led to or prevented them. She sat quite still and silent, looking out of the window, with her thin hands resting in her lap. Her head was turned away from most of the people, but I was sitting where I could see her, and the light of the evening sky was on her face. It made her look very soft. She lifted up her eyes and looked far off toward the horizon. I remember it recalled to me, young as I was, the speech I had heard someone once make when I was a little boy, and which I had thought so ridiculous, that, when she was young, before she caught that cold, she was almost beautiful. There was an expression on her face that made me think she ought always to sit looking out of the window at the evening sky.